This is Unstructured.
Today I'm excited to bring a guest who's actually doing great things for humanity. His name is Jesse Richardson, and Jesse runs the site yourfallacy.is.com. This site is wonderful, and I reference it all the time because it goes into all kinds of logical fallacies that trip us up every day. Nobody's perfect. How are you doing today, Jesse?
I'm doing great, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for coming on. And honestly, I actually hang around with a bunch of people online who are much smarter than I am, and they love your posters. And as a result, your posters have been served up to me more than a few times.
Yeah, it's happened, ironically enough, it's been served to me as well.
I have to confess, I tried to arm myself and did buy a deck of your cards.
Oh, nice.
And was really surprised to see that they're actually fulfilled here in Virginia.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. My warehouse is in Virginia Beach, and we sell some posters and a deck of critical thinking cards, but we also make those resources available under Creative Commons at the websites for teachers and students to use all around the world.
Yeah, I wanted to go through a little bit of the history. I understand that you're a creative director for Flip, and this is an advertising or web building agency?
Yeah, digital ad agency, yeah.
Well, what brought you into the whole arena of logical fallacies and whatnot?
Well, I've kind of been an amateur scholar of philosophy since I was about 13 or 14 years old. Through a series of fortunate or unfortunate events, depending on how you want to look at it, I fell ass backwards into the world of design and advertising. And it's been a really quite a lark. It's been a fun journey. But the truth at the base of what advertising is that you're selling crap to people that they don't really need. And as a person who's a student of ethics and philosophy, I had some misgivings about that and wanted to balance my ethical karma to some extent. So I got involved in politics and attempting to, contribute to the world in various ways. But really, it kind of became apparent to me that there was an alignment between this love I had for philosophy and rationality and thinking about things in terms of reason and what I do for my profession, which is advertising. And what's kind of relevant and interesting about that is that within advertising, what we're tasked to do a lot of the time is take a complex subject matter and communicate it really simply to distill what is, the most relevant aspect of a proposition and to, put that on a billboard or in a television commercial in such a way that it's compelling and persuasive. And what I saw is that there is this really big gap when we look at what's happening in the world of politics and media, where people are trying to communicate these quite academic and dense ideas, and there is this real gap of engagement. People are just not connecting to these kinds of concepts, and they're like ships in the night, that there's not a real sense of connecting to what's actually wrong here when we have actual fake news and when we have these distortions of truth, when we have these, manipulations of people's belief structures to, malevolent ends. And so what I saw was the potential for us to take what we know in the marketing world and the advertising world and use that for good instead of evil, to be able to take the concepts of reason and philosophy, the Enlightenment principles, and apply them to the same set of rigor that we use within design and advertising to make them accessible and popular.
That's amazing. And how in the world do you actually distill down such complicated topics to a very simple, easily digestible and identifiable message? I mean, take, for instance, your cards. You're taking a large concept and literally representing it on a single playing card.
Mm-hmm.
You are literally using one sentence to describe something. How did you go about that? And what was the most challenging concept that you had to convey?
Oh, gosh, I don't know which would have been the most challenging one. It's one of those things that you learn as a copywriter, the craft of like taking something complicated and trying to, take it down and down and down and down and down. I mean, Einstein famously said that, genius is complexity made simple. And the more you, I don't by any means claim to be a genius, but you get a glimpse of that when you are in editing mode and you take something that is like, someone has attempted to, tell you what's great about their product, or, is persuasive about their political argument or whatever else. And when you take that like paragraph of text and you go, okay, what's the really core idea here? There's a really interesting artifact that happens is when you hit it, there's this effect. It's like a Venn diagram of meaning, and everything intersects, and it's got this layered effect. And semantically, and in terms of the communicability of it, it's just like, oh yeah, that really. It's not just about being simple, because anyone could be simple, but when you say something simple that has a lot of sort of unsaid meaning to it, when it has a power beyond itself, because it articulates things in a way that captures a deeper meaning. That's what you're chasing. That's what I attempted to do to some extent with logical fallacies and cognitive biases, to be able to distill each one of them down into a single simple sentence that essentially a 10-year-old can understand, not in a condescending way, but just in a simplified sort of way. So that was the challenge in terms of the craft, and it seemed to resonate quite well, because a lot of people use the sites to, point out fallacies in various online arguments using the website address, which kind of becomes an actual line, because you can say yourfallacy.is.com strawman or whatever else as a riposte to someone having misrepresented your argument.
Which is fantastic. And I must commend you too, because you managed to make the cards and the messages to be fun and not condescending. And that is a very, very challenging thing to do. Because when you get into these circles, and I hate to say Asperger's disease arguments, it can get very, very ugly quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, seeing as that I'm, shall we say, a remedial student, I'm wondering if you can help me out and describe the difference between a fallacy and a bias. Is a fallacy something you project or do, and a bias is something that you have?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So I'll go with fallacies first. So a logical fallacy is a term within the school of philosophy, essentially. And what it is it relates to the coherency of an argument. So to understand what that means, we have to think about what is an argument. It's not a yelly situation where we're, disagreeing with each other violently. An argument in the philosophical sense is when we have premises, like just these points that we have, that lead to a conclusion logically. Now, the really key thing to understand about logical fallacies is that it's not about the truth claim. You could argue for something that is completely false with a logically coherent argument, no fallacies in it. Conversely, you can say a complete lie. You can say something that is completely not true. The inverse. You can say that something is completely true and have entirely fallacious arguments to support it. But what happens more often than not is that when people make a claim that is untrue, they will tend to use logical fallacies to make their argument seem more compelling than it is. So it's interestingly, it's kind of like the just because someone is making a good argument doesn't necessarily mean what they're saying is true. But we can, to some extent, say, well, you need to make a better argument for something if it's not holding up coherently, if it's not making sense logically, that this follows from that you're actually using this kind of obfuscation. You're kind of using this way to trick us or make us seem like it's something that it isn't. That's what a fallacy is, essentially. And I suppose probably the best way to explain it is to give a couple of examples, because then you go, okay, I get it. And that's when the aha moment happens, is when you go, right, I've had that experience when someone misrepresents my argument. I wasn't saying that, but they've taken it and made it out to be something that it isn't. And that's what we call a straw man fallacy, which is a type of red herring. It's misrepresenting the truth of what you were really saying. And everyone's had that experience when they've argued with someone online, right? Another one would be like an appeal to nature fallacy. So that's like saying something like, well, how could, sunlight be bad because it's natural, or, we should eat soybeans or natural grains only because, that's what our Paleolithic ancestors, ate. And so because it's natural, therefore it's good. But what, of course, that misses is that just because something's natural doesn't necessarily mean it's good. You can arsenic's natural and it can kill you, and you could argue that murder is natural, and we don't really necessarily want too much of that going on. So the fact of something being natural isn't what makes it good. It's just that it works as a rhetorical device, because so often we find that if something's natural, like, for instance, eating vegetables or fruit, which is a natural thing, and we've evolved to be, for that to have benefit to us, we go, well, as a method of correlation, we associate natural things with things being good for us, because usually they are. But it's not the state of it being natural that makes it so. And so saying that sunlight is natural, therefore it's good, and therefore we shouldn't wear sunscreen because it's a conspiracy by big pharma and government to control us and, infect us with their, distilled chemtrail anti-vaccine propaganda, doesn't really make sense. It's a long bow to draw, and it doesn't hold together as an argument.
That makes me think of appeal to authority.
Yeah.
And that's extremely powerful, can lead to all kinds of havoc. Have you heard of the Milgram experiment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that ultimately a demonstration of how powerful appeal to authority actually is?
Absolutely. And, we're kind of taught from a very early age from our parents often to respect authority and to defer to authority, and, that we should do what our teacher says, we should do what our parent says, we should do what the police officer says, and so on. And so we have this kind of default response to authority that serves us well as group animals a lot of the time, but also can have these very negative outcomes, as we see in authoritarian states, Weimar Germany, and, various points in history where us not questioning authority and not having the capacity to be able to think independently as individuals results in very great evils indeed. And one of the great things about liberal democracies and having, the capacity for, individual thought and freedom of speech and the free exchange of ideas is that we can mitigate those effects of just, subservient control and abdication of power to authority.
I guess I actually should take the time and discuss what the Milgram experiment is.
Yes. Yeah.
Dr. Milgram and his family were Jewish, and his parents suffered in the concentration camps during World War II. And he wanted to make a study of what was it that would make normal people, who ultimately became camp guards, turn into complete monsters. So he devised an experiment which had 3 people in it. You had a teacher, a student, and a physician, or who is presumed to be a physician, overlooking the experiment. And as the experiment went, the teacher would apply shocks to the student whenever the student got a question wrong. And a vast majority of these teachers actually applied enough shock.
And a surprising amount of people went all the way to what they knew was a potentially fatal level of electricity that they were administering to the subject. And they were
the majority.
Yeah. And they and followed through with that. And so it's one of these things that there's an interesting corollary here to advertising, where everyone thinks they're not affected by advertising. But everyone is, these companies aren't spending their massive budgets for fun. There's some very real data showing that advertising is effective, but none of us feel like we're affected by ads. But, when we're making that split decision in the moment of the supermarket aisle, we're the same as the people in the Milgram experiment. We're all affected by these biases in our psyche, where, we take these cues of that person's got a lab coat on, or this person is wearing a badge, or that person has this role within government, and so therefore I should believe what they say. And when you say that point blank to someone, they go, no, of course not. I don't believe that. That doesn't make it any less true that reality has an effect upon us and how we react in the moment. We all like to think of ourselves as these very independent, rational beings, rational agents. But the truth is that we are all affected by various biases and various codified ways of behaving that have been inculcated on us since we were born, and that act subconsciously before we have any awareness of them.
I actually had a question on that and have been wondering, since you're an ad guy, maybe you can help answer this. Are they focused so much on the age groups of, say, 18 to 29 or whatever? Because when people buy their first product, they'll tend to become their product, like a Ford family for life?
That's certainly part of many advertisers' strategies, but it's multifaceted, right? Like, it depends on what your product is and what your objectives are. Some brands like a Ford might take a very long-term view and want to, be looking at a generational, strategy. Much of the time, it's a lot more immediate than that, and it's like the next quarter's earnings are far more of an imperative than year view of like the brand salience and locking people in. So it depends on the product, it depends on the market, it depends on a lot of variables. But certainly one of the interesting things is that we attribute probably a little bit too much, I suppose, credit to advertisers in terms of their ability to be able to understand people's psyches. Worked in the industry for a long time. There's certainly some very smart people that do some very sophisticated targeting techniques, but a lot of it's just really kind of like just shots in the dark as well. I'm much more surprised when I come across competence than when I come across incompetence. That's in every field. So there is certainly a level of manipulation that occurs within all marketing and politics and media. But a lot of the time, it's a lot of there's more malice and this idea of conspiracy and everyone rubbing their hands together and there's some grand global plan. Just if you've ever been a project manager, you know that it's very difficult to orchestrate 5 people doing something in synchrony, let alone 5,000.
True. So now let's divert to bias.
Mm-hmm. So psychological biases, cognitive biases, essentially there's was a relatively new field of study in the 70s, spearheaded by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, and his colleague.
Thinking Fast and Slow?
Yeah, correct. Author of Thinking Fast and Slow, which is an excellent book, by the way, and his partner in crime and psychological research, Amos Tversky, who they pioneered a lot of psychological experiments that essentially showed that we are a lot less rational than we presume ourselves to be when put in certain circumstances. We can be primed to make decisions with various cues and manipulations that undermine this idea that we are perfectly rational agents that are going to do things absent our own personal biases, the environmental biases that we might be subjected to, social and cultural biases and expectations. There's a whole range of things that affect our judgment, and we presume ourselves to be unaffected by them, much like advertising, and advertising exploits biases as much as fallacies. Again, probably giving a couple of examples will help to elucidate and make clear how and why cognitive biases affect us. So a good one as an example is the anchoring bias, where essentially if you're in a financial negotiation, say for a salary or the price of a car, you can, experimental research shows that whoever makes the first offer has a strong determining effect of the outcome of that negotiation. So if you anchor the price for, say, a used car and you say, well, this is going to cost you 10 grand, and you're the used car salesperson, you might get a counter offer of, well, 5 grand is half that. Whereas if the person who had started the negotiation had been the buyer and had said 3 grand, the natural kind of anchoring response to that would be 6 rather than 5. So you can see how it plays out, that the negotiation tends to be anchored to the initial price as a kind of reasonable negotiation to a halfway point between those or thereabouts. And this affects many different aspects, not just financial negotiations, but we can, with the framing effect and anchoring effect working in unison, there's ways to be able to prime various conversations, negotiations, and situations in which we find ourselves, in which whoever speaks first tends to dominate or at least guide the conversation in a particular direction. And if you're aware of how and why those things might affect the outcome, then you can manipulate them to your own ends.
That makes me think of MSRP. It's like a universal anchoring.
Sorry, what's MSRP?
Manufactured suggested retail price.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah, we have RRP here in Australia. Yes. Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. But yeah, the when you have that, and oftentimes people will use, and it's a very good example of anchoring bias actually, because people, retailers will inflate their prices far above what would be a reasonable price that anyone would pay for a particular product, and then when they give you a 30% off the RRP. Then you feel like you're getting a bargain when in fact you're just spending money.
True, or you're just using coupons and you think you're actually saving money off of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, previously, you had mentioned Daniel Kahneman and Abe Tversky. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Would you agree that they are just simply proving with modern science what hucksters and the like have known throughout time?
To some extent, yes. Certainly, snake oil salespeople have been manipulating and using these techniques. But what Tversky and Kahneman did was they put it into a scientific framework that actually showed how and why that works and to what extent it works. So it was really important for us to be able to quantify that in a way from the vague kind of, idea of that, yes, people are manipulable, which we kind of already intuitively knew, but it was always other people, not us, you see. The really interesting thing that they did was show, okay, well, how manipulable are people? What percentage of people can be manipulated and to what extent, and how much do we all suffer these biases? And one of the kind of surprising and counterintuitive and instructive results of their research is that everyone is subject to biases. And this, I think, brings home a really important point that we kind of we do that thing where we think that critical thinking is something that we are already masters of, that we ourselves don't suffer these biases. We ourselves aren't subject to, being manipulated by advertisers or politicians or the media. And the more you learn about the subject matter, the more intellectually humble you become. And that's a really important and really instructive lesson, because until we foster that intellectual humility in ourselves, until we realize that we are all flawed, and it's not a harsh kind of indictment of our own intellect to be able to say, I might be wrong about things, and I'm manipulable, and I'm malleable, and I suffer biases, and and when we have that understanding, an ironic thing takes place, because by the very fact of recognizing that, we actually mitigate those effects. We actually lessen them. We limit how much we can be manipulated by realizing that we can. And if we don't realize that we can be manipulated, if we don't realize that we are easily fooled, if our biases and our prejudices can't be used against us, then we are so much more able to be manipulated. We are so much more open and receptive to being used by politicians and marketers and people with vested interests to manipulate us to their own ends and to our own deficit, to our own destruction potentially as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I interview a lot of people who are, shall we say, in the persuasion field, influence, those who have been trained by Robert Cialdini, etc. And one of the guys I interview, among his favorite types to deal with are cocksure people. And this is somebody who ran prisons. Mm-hmm. And he would play into their egos so much. It was quite hilarious. He would come in with frumped up clothing and act like people were yelling at him, etc. He wound up doing a whole Columbo routine. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Columbo or not.
Yeah, just one more thing, yeah.
Exactly. He was dressed very slovenly and rattled and acted a little bit off and always asked, oh, just one more thing. And they'd wind up revealing information to them because they were unsuspecting.
Yeah, and it has the effect of disarming someone who presumes themselves to be in a superior position, which is a very effective negotiating technique. Yeah.
Now, on the flip side, these biases exist for a reason, right? For example, a negative or negativity bias kept us alive. Like, if we heard a noise in the bush, the one who went to investigate the noise quite often, well, his genes didn't pass down.
Absolutely. So, I mean, another kind of way that we can think about biases is the heuristics, the shortcuts of thinking. And the thing is that they work a lot of the time, and the same with fallacies all the time too. So the appeal to nature fallacy is an example. Natural things are generally good for you, vegetables and fruit and grains, and whereas highly processed food, not so much. And so it's a reasonable inference for us to make. It's reasonable for us to think, yeah, natural things are good. That's not a silly thing to think in the first place. But where it falls down, where we need to be careful, is when we conflate that kind of general rule as an absolute rule, and then the reason that's a really important thing for us to understand is that people take that presumption that we have of natural things are good, therefore all natural things are good, and they'll sell us some homeopathy because it's natural, whatever else, and we don't get our radiation therapy for cancer treatment, like Steve Jobs infamously, regretted on his deathbed that he, that he believed in that instead of empirical science. And
Bob Marley as well.
Yeah. So there is this there's this this very real negative that happens as a result of something that is generally okay and generally good. And I think there's a mistake we make in trying to frame this as in an absolute sense. It's kind of contextual and independent. It's okay for us to make these heuristic general kind of inferences a lot of the time. It's okay for us to go, yeah, generally speaking, let's, run around a bit and eat healthy, natural food. That's great. No problem with that at all. But please don't presume that just because it comes from a pharmaceutical company, it's, inherently bad and processed and is going to kill you. Because, taking, antibiotics is going to be a lot better for your bacterial infection than putting crystals on your seventh chakra.
Very, very true. And of course, anything bad can be good. Anything good can be bad, depending on the application.
And dosage, yeah.
That actually reminds me of Tim Noakes out of South Africa. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's had an ongoing battle with the, shall we say, fluid companies like Gatorade and sports drinks and things like that, because we are pushed all the time to overhydrate, drink water. And if you drink too much water, well, you actually can die.
Yeah, overhydration.
They have that problem at raves and even some races.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like everything, it's dosage. You eat too many carrots, you'll die. You drink too much water, you'll die. And again, it's the same mistake that we make, that we try to reduce things to absolutes. And this is a peculiar aspect of Western thought generally, is that we have this kind of very axiomatic view, I call it, where we try to reduce things to this absolute rule that we can apply to everything. It's within philosophy, it's a very Kantian idea. It's this idea of universal kind of axiomatic deontology, where we want to go, okay, here's the absolute rule. How do we apply it to everything? How do we make this the thing that is really the base truth of everything? And I think what the reality is so much of the time is it's not those absolutes. It's not those axiomatic things that are representative of what's really going on. It's often a lot more complicated and nuanced and grey. And this presents a real problem when we get into the sphere of politics and healthcare and all these other things, because those simplistic narratives, they're a lot easier to sell, and they're a lot people latch onto them. They attach to our heuristic mindsets much more easily than if we have this much more, it's much more difficult to prosecute a case for a more, nuanced and contingent and contextual view of things. But that's the real world, and it's less sexy a lot of the time, but it's the truth, and the truth has a real power and has real outcomes and consequences.
That actually makes me think about the tax cuts that happened recently here in America, there was a group of people who were very against the tax cuts. And when people were receiving less back on tax returns, they took it as an opportunity to say, oh, see, the tax cuts weren't that great. You're getting less money back, so therefore it's not really meaningful. Not taking into account the fact that, no, if you pay less in, you get less out.
Yeah.
And it just sounded so smooth. See, you didn't get any return. Obviously, it's only for the rich.
Yeah. It's and it ignores, like, a lot of the time, nuanced arguments are a lot less palatable to anyone with an ideological agenda, whatever their ideological agenda is. So it's, economics is a particularly complex area of study, and, many economists disagree about almost everything and variables at play, in terms of, how things actually work within that sphere. So, asserting with certainty how anything in particular works is difficult at the best of times. But it's a really unfortunate thing that there is this inverse relationship where the more sure somebody is of something, the more successful they will tend to be in the sphere of politics and media and everything else, because they're prosecuting a simplistic agenda that gets a lot more traction. Whereas the people that are a little bit more circumspect and less sure of themselves tend to not get nearly so much traction. And that brings to, like, my favorite quote of all time by Bertrand Russell, which is, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are so sure of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts. And I think that kind of encapsulates the entirety of that, of what's wrong there, is that, and in experimental research that's borne out with the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a particularly interesting bias and area of study, because we see this very clear gradient going from one side of ignorance to the other. Are you familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Oh, I absolutely am, but I would love it if you explained it. I think we all suffer it.
Yeah, we do, and exactly. And the more on the meta level, it's interesting. If we know that we suffer it less, right? So, but there's this what the Dunning-Kruger effect showed essentially in experimental research is that the more sort of ignorant we are about something, the more confident and cocksure we're likely to be. But one of the lessons,
like teenagers,
exactly right. It's like I'm paraphrasing poorly here, but it's like I couldn't believe how much my old man learned between the ages of 14 and 21. He really seemed to wise up in that time, So we have this a huge blind spot when we're ignorant. There are unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, and
he was mocked for that, by the way.
Oh yeah.
And he was actually dead on.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Donald Rumsfeld, but I'll concede that point. Strategically, that's anyone that's involved in any form of strategy knows that there's known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is that, like, with the Dunning-Kruger effect, what we have is this really clear set of research that shows us that the more people understand things, the less likely they are to be sure of themselves. But and what most people know about the Dunning-Kruger effect is that it's ignorant people are the most confident. And that's a really interesting finding in and of itself, and explains a lot of different aspects of how people react in the political and social and medical and lots of different areas. The reason why anti-vaccination and all these other things tends to get a lot of traction is that people are really confident because they read one Google article on a blog, that told them this thing, and they, don't really have a lot of body of knowledge. Whereas you'll talk to an expert immunologist, and their language will seem so much more caveated. They'll say, well, what we know is this, but we're unsure about this aspect of this, and there's still some more research to be done about that. It's like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's like got all these gray areas. He's really not sure. But
yeah, he's all squishy. Try to pin him down.
But this person over here, they are rock solid. They're really sure of themselves, So what we found is that the more domain knowledge someone had about a particular area, the more likely they were to underestimate their own capacity to be able to understand and their own expertise. So it's this really interesting artifact and aspect of human psychology that we go from a state of being hugely overconfident the more ignorant we are, and then hugely underconfident the more we know. So the takeout of that is the more we know we don't know.
Have you ever heard of gel-man amnesia?
No, please enlighten me.
I feel like gel-man amnesia is kind of a cousin to Dunning-Kruger. Like, I work in tech, and I'll read articles, and I'll be like, that's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know what they're talking about. This is untrue. Mm-hmm. Well, with gel-man, if you are the expert on something
Yeah, sorry, I forgot the name of it. Yes, it's fantastic. Please go on, sorry.
Oh, no problem. But yeah, you're an expert on a subject, and you read articles, and they're wrong about the subject. But yet, when you read an article about another subject, you just automatically believe it, which is quite crazy. If they're wrong about something you do know, then odds are they're likely to be wrong about something you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't transpose our understanding and knowledge of just how inaccurate media can be when it's our own domain of knowledge, and realize that it's just as sensationalistic and just as shallow and just as likely to be off the mark when they're talking about almost anything else, depending on the media organization, of course.
You should have a card for that one, too. I feel like it's really closely related to Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah, the same mechanisms are certainly at play there in terms of that. Yeah, there's we have, and again, it's unknown unknowns in terms of our blind spots, right? We don't have a clear understanding of what it is that we are unaware of. And so what we do is we transpose what we do know and presume that to be an accurate representation. And the really interesting thing is that the more you start to doubt yourself, the more you start to be circumspect and intellectually humble and a little bit less sure of your own conclusions and your own apparatus to be able to come to conclusions, the more likely you are to actually be closer to the truth, yet the less likely you are to seem like you are, right? And so there's this really terrible consequence in the sphere of how we relate to each other, where we essentially, the narratives that get traction are the ones that are more likely to be wrong. And we see this happening on a kind of, like, you can look at it within a particular organization as well. So often within group dynamics within a company, really confident, loud voices will tend to dominate how a group dynamic is working in terms of, whether it's a strategic meeting or idea generation or something else like that. The voices you want to be listening to as a leader or, the head of a company are not those loud confidence voices, because they're arrogant, and that is indicative of they lack the capacity to be able to analyze things well and have, an amount of intellectual humility to be able to take a step back and, really consider things. It's the quiet voices that get, trampled over, that don't, tend to, speak up for themselves, that tend to be the more logical, the more rational, the more intelligent perspectives. But they don't generally want to, yell above the confident person that's, dominating the conversation.
Yeah, you almost have to design your teams with that in mind, in a manner, because you do want the brash person sometimes.
Sure.
They could be leadership or inspirational to others around them, but you may want to control for that, like having the quiet one with the loud one.
There are ways to do that as well. We're actually just about to release a project in the next couple of months about
perfect.
It's about creative, idea generation and divergent thinking that goes into various techniques to use to mitigate that within groups. One of the really interesting things JFK did is that he would, amongst his advisors, not speak first. He was cognizant of the effect of his power and position, and he'd have all of his advisors speak before he proffered his own opinion. So that's one example from a systems design point of view where you can mitigate the effects of that. If you're a wise leader, you need to be aware of those power dynamics and how, that affects it, and how do you elicit the voice of the circumspect and the introverted. Writing it down is a really good way to do it as well. So there's a few different brainstorming techniques where you essentially allow everyone to have a kind of equal voice and input to things without it being determined by the social dynamics of, like, this person had this idea and spoke first and spoke loudly, and everyone kind of bounced off that. And the politics of personalities was therefore the determinant of the strategy of the company, when in actuality, what we should have been doing was anonymizing our ideas and evaluating them anonymously, and then talking about them openly in separate groups, and, coming to a filtered understanding, or getting a third party who wasn't involved in the idea generation to be the evaluator of them while they were anonymized. There's various ways that you can mitigate those sorts of effects, but it all comes down to the same kinds of mechanisms of our foibles and our faults and our biases are ever present. And if we're aware of them, there's so many different ways that we can help to offset them, but we need to become aware of them first. Otherwise, we're lost.
That's good to hear. So with the biases and fallacies right now, you're pointing out the problems, but seems like you're starting to work on maybe providing solutions or mitigating them.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, it's a funny thing. Like I kind of like this whole project came about from a kind of epiphany moment where I realized that, as a species, we might be doomed if we don't learn how to think for ourselves en masse. And after arguing with a lot of people online who were very wrong about lots of different things, I realized that I wasn't changing their minds nearly as much as I wanted to. And so after feeling a little bit despairing for a while, I realized, well, let's look at this strategically. If this was a brief given to me and I was, thinking about this, of how do I solve this actual problem, what would I do? And the realization I had is that it's a lot easier for us to teach the next generation to think independently than it is to teach adults who are very mired in their views. So what I tried to do was to facilitate teaching anyone and everyone, but especially kids, how to think for themselves, and to let them, draw their own conclusions rather than trying to enforce a particular way of thinking about the world on them. To say, well, here's the tools of reason. Here's the capacity to think for yourself. Here's how we should analyze media and those that would seek to manipulate us. I trust you to be able to, hopefully draw a logical, rational, and intelligent conclusion as a result of you having these skills, rather than telling you this is the correct way to act because my father did it before me, or, this is the way that we do things, or whatever else.
That kind of reminds me of a quotation a friend of mine often uses, that science advances one funeral at a time, or something like that.
Yes. Yeah, quite. I think that's true of politics and everything else as well, is that, people become mired in their views, and, it's like there's one death at a time is the meter by which we move forward to some extent. And we've seen an incredible amount of progress over the last 400 years because of the Enlightenment principles, because of, in particular, the American project and what's happened in Europe since the French Revolution. And, this kind of exaltation of individual, capacity for inalienable rights and freedom of speech and liberal democracy that really underpin philosophically why we are living in the most peaceful, prosperous time in history with all this wonderful potential, despite all of the, very real existential threats that face us. And so we live in, as I said to you in the preamble to our conversation, Eric, the most interesting of times, because there is so much at stake at the moment in terms of, where our world's going to go in the next 50 years, and what we do now and how we act, and the institutions, and the way that we structure our education system in particular, but all of the aspects of our society is going to be so important, and it's becoming more and more important. And a lot of people are really despairing of the polarized nature of politics, and that we're talking past each other and that we're not connecting. And I think we really need to listen to each other and try and come to a shared understanding, rather than just butting heads against each other. And reason and philosophy and being able to engage in civilized conversation and understand each other is, I think, the only way forward in that way.
That's a perfect point to close this conversation. And people need to follow you and go to schoolofthought.org. Everything leads out of there, correct?
Correct. And the other sites are yourfallacy.is or yourbias.is. And you can download all of the materials there for free. And we'll be releasing some more free Creative Commons materials later this year.
Fantastic. And thanks so much for coming on.
Cheers, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, please consider subscribing for free. And I mean for free. It is always free. There's no billing, anything else. You can subscribe in your player of choice, which is probably right in your hands, or you can go to unstructuredpod.com, and there are plenty of links there. Thank you so much. And in the spirit of sharing, here's a couple more shows you may want to check out.
Hi, I'm Tyson Franklin, the host of It's No Secret with Dr. T, which is a small business and marketing podcast. Each week, I interview business leaders who openly share the secrets to the massive success. It's No Secret with Dr. T will educate, entertain, and inspire you. Check it out. You'll find it wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can go to my website, tysonfranklin.com.
I did not grow up with very much money.
Money's energy.
Money is something that really scares me.
You had about 60 grand in debt.
Money isn't the answer.
Somebody should just give me a lot of money.
My dream was to be the WWE wrestler, but you realize that your dreams change over the years.
Money's a tool. It's a key to a gate. And at the other side of the gate is the things that you really want to do with your life. It's the things that matter most to you. It's pursuing those values that make you ultimately happy.
Listen to Inspired Money at inspiredmoney.fm.